Hello everybody and welcome back to the GNU Lectures channel. In this video we'll be discussing the best distros for beginners. I'm focusing mainly on distros that are Ubuntu/Debian or Arch based. Ubuntu and Debian both use the apt package manager, but Ubuntu has support for what are called PPAs. The advantage of using an Ubuntu or Debian based distro is the community support, since most beginner-friendly distros are based on either. If you encounter an issue, then the fix is most likely going to be tailored for it. On the other hand, Arch always has the most up-to-date software, and most programs can be found in its package manager called Pacman, or its community package manager called the AUR. But on Debian and Ubuntu you might rely on something else such as a Flatpak or Snap, which might not be as stable, or take up more space. Some people say Arch is more stable, while others say Debian and Ubuntu are more stable, but from my experience they are about the same. The first step is determining whether you have a 32-bit or 64-bit CPU. This isn't exclusive to Linux, but if you have a 32-bit CPU then you can't use a 64-bit operating system. Most computers made after 2007 have 64-bit CPUs, but if you have a computer older than that, or you're using a device such as a Windows tablet or netbook, then there's a possibility it uses a 32-bit CPU. Some distros also have versions made for ARM to run on something like a Raspberry Pi. There are two main display servers for Linux, Xorg and Wayland. The display server is what allows any sort of graphical element to be displayed. Wayland is newer and faster, but Xorg is more extensible and has been the default choice on Linux for a long time, so it's arguably more stable. Most distros use Xorg, but many are switching to Wayland. An important aspect of distros is the pre-installed desktop environment. Now you can run any desktop environment on any distro, but for many the default desktop environment makes or breaks a first experience, and most distros will have some customization to the desktop environment. A desktop environment determines what your desktop experience is going to be like. They include a window manager and utilities such as a file explorer, volume and network control, default keybinds, panels, terminal emulator, and some basic programs such as a web browser and a text editor. Some desktop environments are made to look more Windows-like, such as KDE Plasma, Cinnamon, and LXQT, while others are made to look more Mac-like such as GNOME, Budgie, Deepin, and Pantheon. But most of these can be configured to some extent to look different. For example, KDE Plasma has a lot of customization and can be made to look almost identical to macOS. Anyway, here are 5 distros I recommend for beginners, or anybody really, along with some honorable mentions. First up is Popos, which is a stylish Ubuntu-based distro from a company called System76. You can buy a PC with Popos installed, but you can also install it yourself. Despite using the GNOME desktop environment, which isn't as lightweight as others, I've always found Popos to be fast and responsive. I also found it to be one of the easiest to use for beginners, because even though GNOME doesn't really resemble anything, it's quite a static environment, so after playing around for a few minutes you sort of know where everything is. One of my favorite features is the tiling mode that isn't in standard GNOME. Next up is Manjaro, which is based on Arch Linux, and its purpose is to make Arch easier to use, because installing Arch from scratch can be overwhelming for beginners. Manjaro has official ISOs for GNOME, KDE, and XFCE, but it also has ones created by the community for other desktop environments. I personally use Manjaro KDE as my main distro. I really like Manjaro because almost everything is an official repository, the AUR, and I can find a program I need in Pamac. Manjaro also comes with Steam pre-installed, and many people, myself included, think it's a great distro for gaming. Third, we have Linux Mint. This is the most popular Ubuntu-based distro besides Ubuntu itself, and it's one that is loved by many, so there is a lot of community support. It is Ubuntu-based like Popos, and by default it has ISOs for Cinnamon, Mate, and XFCE. They all have a similar layout to Windows and they're all fairly lightweight, so I'd just pick any of them. Linux Mint has additional add-ons that other distros don't have, such as media codecs and a utility for deb packages, so things will just work without having to faff around. Fourth we have Kubuntu, which is basically Ubuntu, but with KDE Plasma instead of Unity GNOME. Kubuntu doesn't have the same faults that standard Ubuntu does. If you want to use KDE Plasma, then I think Kubuntu is a great distro. It has a good balance between the stability of KDE Neon and the bleeding edge software you'd find on Manjaro KDE. Similarly, you have other flavors of Ubuntu with desktop environments, but overall Kubuntu is my favorite. Last but not least we have Elementary OS. Elementary is quite unique as it uses its own desktop environment called Pantheon. It's kind of Mac-like, but it isn't made to replicate Mac OS. Elementary is a pay-as-you-want distro. You can pay $0 for a program, $1, $500, it's up to you. It's also very privacy respecting, and it features software that integrates nicely into the environment. Just like with GNOME on Popos, if you want a static environment that won't confuse you, Elementary OS is a good choice. If you want to use Pantheon, then you should use Elementary, because installing Pantheon on another distro is not as easy as installing something like KDE Plasma. Now for some honorable mentions. These are good distros, but have issues that are holding me back from recommending it to beginners. First we have Artix Linux. Artix is based on Arch Linux, but instead of using systemd, you get to choose the init system you want to use. Artix has very small ISO sizes, and Artix has versions for different desktop environments, but you can also install it the same way you install Arch Linux. I have played around with Artix and think it's quite cool, but the only reason I'm not recommending it yet is because I'm not as familiar with it as I'm with Manjaro, and I think people might accidentally download the base version and get confused when trying to install it. My second honorable mention is Fedora. Now Fedora uses its own package manager. It uses a fairly standard version of GNOME, and it uses completely open source software. Above all, I like Fedora because it is incredibly reliable. But if you have hardware that relies on a proprietary driver, I can't guarantee that it will work natively like it would in other distros, which is what's holding me back from recommending it to a beginner. My third honorable mention is Debian, which allows you to choose the desktop environment and utilities you want directly in the installer. The reason I'm not recommending it is because while it is much easier to install than other minimal distros like Arch or Gentoo, it's still not as easy as installing others I mentioned in the list. Plus it doesn't have a live environment, so you can't try it before installing. Anyway, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next video, which will be showing you how to actually install a distro.